Hey guys, what's up? This is Diego here at Cinemageddon Reviews. So in my last analysis video, I talked about The Last of Us Part 1, which was an excellent remake of an already fantastic game, and I also talked about some of the deeper messages in the story and the characters. This time, I'm bringing things full circle with my thoughts on The Last of Us Part 2. Now, I know that this is a very heavily debated game, and a lot of people have some pretty mixed feelings about it, and I also understand that a large amount of people still haven't played this game. So here's what I'm going to do. First, for those of you still curious or who may be unsure what to make of this game before you decide to invest in it, I'm going to do a spoiler-free version of my thoughts. I'll talk about only the plot details I need to so that you can get the basic gist of what I think about the game, but I won't get into specifics. After I'm done with my spoiler-free review, I'm going to give you my spoiler warning and then dive deep into The Last of Us Part 2, exploring every specific detail about the story and the characters, and what my thoughts are on the deeper aspects of the story. This way, I can be as comprehensive as possible and still get my point across to everybody. Now, I am going to show gameplay footage, which is going to be very violent. It's going to have a lot of blood and gore, so just trigger warning in this one. This may be hard to watch for some of you. And one more warning to you guys who haven't played the game. The Last of Us Part 2 has been review bombed and spoiled in every comment section on every YouTube video I've seen, and I just want to make it clear to you guys that you guys might not be safe from spoilers down in the comment section of this video, so just be warned, stay away from the comment section if you haven't played this game yet. Alright, so now that you know what the plan is, here we go with my spoiler-free review of The Last of Us Part 2. This game picks up 4 years after the events of Part 1, with Ellie, now 19 years old, setting out on a bloodthirsty quest for revenge against the people who wronged her. So this game came out in 2020, which was about 3 years ago, and I'm going to be completely candid, I didn't play this for myself until just recently, and the reason why was because I just heard so many things about it. There was a lot of misogyny, a lot of homophobic and transphobic backlash, and a lot of really harsh criticisms of the game that absolutely flooded social media in the months and weeks leading up to this game. There were also a lot of cutscenes and gameplay footage that leaked in the months leading up to this game, which I unfortunately ran into, and eventually I decided not to invest money in it and do a little more research. So just like what happened with me with the first game, I ended up spoiling the whole thing for myself and read summary after summary, and I watched a ton of Let's Play videos, and I decided I didn't like the game because based on what I knew at the time, the story to me wasn't as satisfying as the first, so I ended up not spending money on it. I had my mind pretty much made up about it for a long time, and it was definitely for the wrong reasons, but then HBO announced that The Last of Us TV show would be renewed for a second season. My initial reaction was apprehensive, because at the time my thoughts on the game were pretty much all negative. But I wanted to give The Last of Us Part 2 a chance because a surprising amount of people have made some really strong arguments as to why they think it's a good game. So I finally bought it, and I went in with an open mind. I decided I didn't want to hate the game because of how different it is from the first one. I thought, hopefully this game can surprise me. Maybe somehow I still don't have the full picture yet. And I have to admit that I did enjoy The Last of Us Part 2 more than I expected, and my perspective on it has changed. But that being said, I still didn't enjoy this game as much as I wanted to. First, let's start with what I did enjoy. Right off the bat, the acting performances in this game are spectacular. Easily the two standouts are Ashley Johnson as Ellie and Laura Bailey as Abby. You could have easily guessed that Ashley Johnson was going to do a great job as Ellie once again. This game takes her character in a different direction than the first game. More on how that was handled later. But she carries that performance extremely well. The rage and the sorrow and the intensity on her face, you don't doubt that for 1 second. Laura Bailey, who did an excellent job in the 2018 Spider-Man game as Mary Jane Watson, also did a great job here as Abby, and man, the internet really did not give her enough credit. She received a ton of ugly death threats and a bunch of hateful messages, which really just goes to show how shitty the internet can be. Her performance was equally intense to Ashley Johnson, and her arc was surprisingly compelling. I was fully expecting to hate this character, but she won me over in a big way. She was easily the biggest surprise of the game for me. The game's writing also makes time to illustrate the character's motivations, and this works for the most part to help us understand why they do the things they do. We'll come back to this later. As I said before, there's a lot of hate surrounding this game, mostly because of bigotry against women and Laura Bailey's character and the LGBTQ+ community, and these people are going to tell you that this game is absolute garbage. I want to make it crystal clear that these criticisms are completely invalid due to the fact that because these people are immature bigots, they were going to hate this game no matter what. They also did something that, in my opinion, is extremely shitty to anyone who doesn't immediately say that this game is perfect. Any negative criticisms surrounding this game that are honest, that come from a place of legitimate disappointment, and not from bigotry or bias, are immediately lumped together with that bigotry and hate anyway. What I can tell you after playing the game for myself is that the LGBTQ+ representation was actually one of my favorite parts of the story. There's a new character named Dina who is introduced as Ellie's new girlfriend, and she was actually one of my favorite new characters. She was likable, she was sympathetic, and most of all, she was something the game uses as an emotional anchor for Ellie and for us to latch on to her side of the story. I liked her character quite a bit, and honestly, I don't feel like we spent enough time with her, because she added a lot of heart to the story. There's another LGBTQ+ character whom I won't spoil right now, so you'll either have to watch my spoiler review or play the game for yourself, but he was easily my favorite character in the game. I found myself rooting for him very quickly, and his side of the story was easily the most compelling. Without getting into spoilers too much, he's also a small part of another aspect of the story, which is in my opinion even stronger in this game than it was in the first one, and that is the world building. The new stuff we explore in The Last of Us Part 2 is fascinating and engrossing. There are some parts of this new world that are terrifying and dark, but also some parts that are actually kind of beautiful. I wish we had spent more time exploring it. This also complemented the action and the combat in the game. Coming off of The Last of Us Part 1, I was surprised to encounter some refreshing action scenes and new combat mechanics. There are new weapons in this game that you can use and new stealth techniques and a lot of new types of enemies to encounter, and there are some new animations for modding weapons and crafting stuff. This is stuff they incorporated into the Part 1 remake to keep it consistent, which I actually appreciated. There are also some pretty cool action scenes throughout the game. There's one that takes place inside a pickup truck between Ellie and this new character named Jesse, and another one with a new type of boss that I thought was terrifying and very creative. I'll definitely be talking about this more in my spoiler review. However, as exciting and intense as these action scenes are, one thing that definitely hinders the entertainment factor of this story is actually the pacing. The game has a surprising amount of downtime and a shit ton of filler. There are quite a few flashback scenes that are used to add context to some of the character development, and while I think it works to the benefit of the characters, I think it also bogs down the pacing and makes the story feel disjointed at times. And a lot of the filler is enjoyable, but after a while I started to notice that it was being used kind of as a distraction to do away with some of the characters while we focus on this one thing right now. And without spoiling anything, because I don't know how much people generally know about this game, but it also makes a choice halfway through the game that completely kills the pacing and resets the momentum of the story. This is a famously controversial decision the game makes, and for some people it's going to work, but for others it won't. So between this pacing issue and the filler and the constant flashback scenes, I felt like I was playing 3 different games at the same time. Speaking of the story, one of the biggest things I knew about going into this game was its use of themes, and probably the biggest theme the story tackles is how revenge can turn people ugly, and how different perspectives can change how you look at a person. I think the game succeeds at this in some aspects and completely fails in others, and this is my biggest negative with the game. Now first of all, I completely understand that people have their reasons for doing the ugly things they do. Zombie apocalypse aside, this is actually something very common in storytelling. All of the best stories across all forms of media do this. Even the first Last of Us game illustrated that having a good motivation doesn't necessarily make your shitty actions less shitty, but it does help you understand them more. In The Last of Us Part 2, they depict Ellie's actions as villainous, while also trying as hard as they can to make Ellie just as much a victim as the people she's hurting. It tries to justify Ellie's pain and anger to make her sympathetic, but also simultaneously condemns her for her actions. This fell completely flat for me, and because of this I really started to hate Ellie as a character and found her extremely annoying, and I found it really hard to get into the story at many points. So overall, now that people are talking about The Last of Us again, you're going to hear a lot of different things surrounding this game. In my opinion, The Last of Us Part 2 has fun gameplay, some really good technical aspects, and some really strong supporting characters, but the story and the way it utilizes its themes is really messy, and it takes risks that don't always stick the landing. This is a story that will work for some people, but won't work for others, and because of this and the large amount of misinformation that's out there, I strongly recommend that you play this game for yourself, or at least watch some Let's Play videos, and find out for yourself whether this game is for you. However, my rating for The Last of Us Part 2 is 3 out of 10. As I said, some of you might enjoy this game, some of you won't. Either way is fine with me, as long as the reason that you don't enjoy this game is because you're not as jacked as Abby.
Got him!
One thing I will admit to is that just like The Last of Us Part 1, the conversations surrounding this game have made it last as long as it has in our minds. So at least it has that going for it. Whether you agree or disagree with my thoughts, at least we can all agree that we're still going to be talking about this game for a long while yet. Alright, so that is my spoiler-free review of The Last of Us Part 2. Right now we're going to dive deep into some spoilers. I left a lot of stuff out of that review so that we could cover it here. This is your spoiler warning. From here on out, you are watching this at your own risk. You have been warned. Okay, let's turn on the lights.
Aziz, light! Aziz, light.
Okay, let's restart the synopsis section of this video because that's actually one of the biggest things I cut out to avoid spoilers. So, here we go. 4 years after the events of The Last of Us Part 1, Ellie sets out on a quest for revenge against Abby Anderson, a former Firefly who brutally murdered Joel to avenge the death of her father in the first game. As Ellie descends into madness on her journey to find Abby, Abby embarks on her own journey to redeem herself by helping 2 young members of a religious cult known as the Seraphites. In the weeks leading up to this game's release, I heard almost everything surrounding the more controversial story points, and pretty much everything that every incel on the internet was complaining about. The perspective switch to Abby halfway through the game, the complete reset of the pacing, killing dogs, the constant flashbacks, the ending, and the way the LGBTQ+ representation was quote-unquote shoved down our throats.
Sure, Jan.
I will say that killing dogs is not a real negative criticism of the game. I will say in retrospect the game is a little too mean-spirited about it, which, coming from a meta point of view, is a little darkly funny. That being said, the dogs are just kind of an obstacle in your way, like you either kill them or you can't advance through the story. However, the one twist that people seemed the most mad about was Abby killing Joel. There were a lot of mean-spirited golf memes that circled the internet when this first leaked, memes that made fun of Abby's muscles and the fact that she was trans?
Are you stupid or something?
These guys were pissed, which especially now after finding out that Abby isn't even the trans character that was supposedly villainized, I find hilarious. It proves that anyone spewing this nonsense not only didn't play the game, but is also just jealous because a woman has bigger muscles than them. After I played the first Last of Us game, Joel dying was actually one of my predictions for the sequel, because even though I was on his side about saving Ellie, I knew that if anyone found out what he did, things wouldn't go so well for him. So when I found out that he did die in this game, I was shocked and very sad because I liked Joel, but I was willing to accept it because it made sense for the character. What actually didn't make sense for me was how soon it happened, because there was still so much of Joel and Ellie's relationship left to explore, especially after that cliffhanger at the end of the first game. It was actually one of the things everyone was looking forward to seeing in the sequel. Now this game does actually explore this, but it's through flashbacks, which do nothing to move the story forward, and it's only there for exposition. Which is why, to me, the moment where Ellie finds out what Joel did feels extremely underwhelming. It didn't have the impact I expected it to on the story. It doesn't change anything about it or about Ellie because it takes place entirely in the past, and the story begins after it already had its impact on the world and the characters. It really leads me to believe that this all should have been covered in another game, and it sounds like the showrunners behind the HBO series agreed because they already announced that the adaptation of this game will be split up into multiple seasons. So maybe that'll become a separate story? We'll come back to this later because for now I would like to still focus on the positives, so let's move on. This is going to be a hot take for quite a few folks, but the Abby portions of the story were actually my favorite ones. Making the switch to Abby halfway through the game was pretty ambitious, and I wasn't sure I was going to be on board with it. It was off to a rocky start when I first started playing as her. Partially it's because she killed Joel, which I still felt sad about, and I was worried that her story was going to come off as forced, and it seemed like it was at the beginning of it. Like the game paints her dad as some sort of humanitarian saint, even though he was definitely willing to kill Ellie without her informed consent. There's also the fact that up until this point as Ellie, you had a pretty well-developed skill tree, and then as Abby, when you start playing as her, you get a whole new one, so you have to pretty much start over from the beginning, and that was pretty disappointing. Nonetheless, Abby's part of the story was actually pretty enjoyable. Once I'd actually started to pick up and I understood what her arc was, I wish this is what we had been playing from the start. She was a much more sympathetic character than I expected, and I found her side of the story really refreshing. Probably the strongest part of her storyline was her relationship with Leb, who was the trans character that I didn't mention before. And as I said before, he was my favorite character in the game. My heart just broke for Lev. At many points, the game puts you in a position to help him and his sister Yara, and this leads to some of my favorite set pieces in the game, the biggest of which is the boss battle in the hospital basement with the Rat King. Holy shit, you guys, the Rat King. Top tier boss battle right there. This is easily my favorite boss battle in the entire Last of Us franchise. However, one complaint I have with Lev's side of the story is that we spent a lot of time with Lev and Yara, and specifically trying to save Yara's life, only for Yara to get shot and die, which kind of makes it feel like a waste. I was pretty disappointed by that. Now, I mentioned earlier that the world building is also at its strongest during the Abby storyline. You get to explore a little bit more about the WLF and this war that's going on with the Seraphites, how some of the wolves feel tired of this war and don't really see the point anymore. Conversely, you get to explore a little bit about how the Seraphites live and what their religion is like, and you get the sense that they're tired of this war too. I was fascinated, and I would have loved to explore more about this. A big complaint that I seem to share with a lot of people is that I couldn't get behind the romance between Owen and Abby, specifically because I felt bad for Mel, who Owen definitely cheated on with Abby. I also just didn't see any chemistry between Owen and Abby. It felt really forced, and I thought Owen was kind of annoying. I think this was the game's attempt at evening the scales between Ellie and Abby as far as who's more shitty of a person, though I think this would have been more effective if it actually had more to do with Ellie, because it feels kind of arbitrary to her side of the story. And that's when I realized what my biggest issue was with the Abby storyline, and that was, as much as I enjoyed it, it's all filler. Like, it feels very disconnected from Ellie's side of the story, except for the way it ties into it at the very end. I mean, yeah, sure, when Ellie kills these characters in her side of the story, it helps humanize them a bit, but that's something that only we, the players, know, and it doesn't really affect Abby's story until the very end. So for a long time, it kind of feels like the story is distracting Abby while Ellie carries out her part of the story somewhere else. So finally, when Abby discovers that Ellie is in Seattle and she's killed all her friends, she's naturally pissed about it, and I never thought I would say this, but I actually felt Abby's anger. I actually completely understood what she wanted Ellie to pay, to the point where I kind of did too. Which is strange to think about, because the whole point of this fight between Abby and Ellie is that you're not supposed to be sure whose side you're on. You're supposed to think that these two characters are kind of equally shitty. It was either that, or you didn't want Abby to be there in the first place because you didn't want this fight to happen. And don't get me wrong, I felt bad that Abby killed Jesse and almost killed Dina, because I liked both of them. But to be fair, Ellie didn't really give a shit about them until they were in danger. Nice going, Ellie. And another reason I sided with Abby pretty much immediately was that as bad as she was in this scene, and the scene where she killed Joel, by comparison, the game kind of eclipsed any hate I had for Abby, because by comparison, we had spent the entire first half of the game dehumanizing Ellie, to the point where when I finally got here, I was just like... So naturally, and pretty satisfyingly, I beat Ellie's ass on the first try, and more importantly, the story didn't make Abby kill Ellie or Dina, which actually made it more satisfying than if she had. Because at this point, the point of this entire story was impossible to miss. Abby's entire journey was about letting go of her hate and realizing that there are better ways to overcome grief. And I was actually kind of proud of her for doing this, and I was surprised that she had won me over this much as a character. I actually really enjoyed her part of the story. Which brings me to my least favorite aspect of this game, and that is Ellie. Yeah, it's actually Ellie that I dislike the most about this game. Specifically because the game's themes require you to somehow empathize with Ellie just as much as Abby, despite her character flaw of being toxically selfish, which absolutely makes her the villain of this game. So the overall message of The Last of Us Part 2, and the reason for the dual perspectives in the first place, is to make the player consider the consequences of revenge, to help them understand that in the real world there's no such thing as good versus evil, and that we're all just different shades of grey, doing things that we believe are justifiable. On Ellie's side of the story, you explore how going on this quest for revenge negatively affects her, and to be fair, there are a few small moments here and there where you do actually feel sorry for her. Most of this comes through Ellie's relationship with Dina, which has some really great moments. Sometimes Ellie will play guitar for her, and it feels like a real connection is happening there. It's intimate and romantic, and it helps you connect with them more. Also, I can't forget to mention this scene between Joel and Ellie at the museum. It was really cute. You know, it was filler, but it was cute. There's some really good moments of tension as well when there's a complication with Dina's pregnancy, and Ellie has to choose between taking Dina home or continue looking for Abby. Even more so when you consider that Ellie has spent absolutely no time searching for Tommy, who is also out looking for revenge. And that's when I noticed that Ellie actually doesn't give a shit about the fact that her friends are in danger. She doesn't give a shit about Tommy. She's just using Tommy as an excuse to lure Dina into coming with her. And that's when I immediately went,
"You are an asshole."
And herein lies my issue with her side of the story. If you feel like Ellie has gone too far in seeking revenge too early on, the rest of the story becomes redundant very fast, and I think that's what happened with me. It's not just that, it's also that the game is pretty much designed to make you feel sorry for the people that you're hurting, even though it wants you to also view Ellie as a sympathetic character despite her unsympathetic actions and decisions. I'm sorry, but no, anybody who thinks sensibly about this automatically stops rooting for Ellie's goal and just immediately starts to dislike her. At least in part 1, when Joel was torturing those two guys, you could at least get behind his goal of finding Ellie, and you understood that these guys were going to kill them first. But Ellie's goal here isn't even justified by her caring about someone's safety. Joel is already dead, and Ellie gains nothing but satisfying her selfish need for revenge by going after Abby. The game often tries to make Ellie look ambivalent by making her do these things to the WLF, or wolves as she starts calling them, and then it tries to humanize her by reminding us of how hurt she is, either through flashbacks with Joel or interactions with Dina. And you're supposed to feel morally conflicted about the things she's doing. But the problem is, because it does such a good job at depicting how short-sighted Ellie is, I didn't empathize with it at all. I think it also didn't help that I had already accepted the fact that Joel was dead and that he had this coming. As much as I cared about Joel and I felt bad for Ellie, ultimately I had made my peace with it, so none of this violence that Ellie was carrying out felt cathartic for me. Now don't get me wrong, I enjoyed a lot of the combat and the action scenes in the game, purely from a gameplay and aesthetic standpoint, but I think I had reached a point emotionally where I was just kind of over it, and I didn't want revenge anymore. In fact, as the game went on, I only felt worse and worse for the people Ellie was hurting. I mean, for Christ's sake, at one point we tortured a poor nurse in a room full of spores, which is objectively worse than what Abby did to Joel. Moving any further in this story after this would just be overkill. And we still have the entire third act to talk about. Oh boy, here we go.
Ladies and gentlemen, fasten your seatbelts.
The third act of this game is probably the worst part for me because it's where everything in this game completely falls apart. Thematically, logically, structurally, and in terms of characterization, none of the writing choices made any sense. It is the one part of this game that absolutely drives me up the fucking wall. We go back to playing as Ellie, and we're on a beautiful farm now. Ellie and Dina are raising a kid together and all these cute little sheep. Ellie also has PTSD from when Joel was murdered, which is understandable. But what I dislike about this, and the reason why I think Ellie is the villain of this game, is that unlike Abby, who learned from her shitty actions and grew as a person, Ellie doesn't learn anything from this. This goes back to what I said about the Fireflies in The Last of Us Part 1. The TLDR version is, Ellie was convinced that her immunity was the only value she had, and the Fireflies were desperate to use this passively suicidal child as a guinea pig, regardless of her consent, because it was their one last chance to save the movement. Never mind the fact that neither she nor the Fireflies could have done anything to save the world if they tried. But still, for that reason, I can't fully empathize with Ellie's anger towards Joel, or her need for revenge. This whole time, even after Joel admitted the truth, she just hasn't realized that her life does have value outside of her immunity. And it's because of this that Joel did what he did. And to be fair, I didn't expect her to realize that right away, but she's had time to think about it, to the point where she was about to start forgiving Joel. And she's holding a token of this value in her hands, in the form of this baby that she and her girlfriend are raising. It never dawns on her that her life can and does have value if she just looks at what's literally right in front of her and sees that she's needed for this. And maybe this way she can posthumously start to forgive Joel. So at the first opportunity, when she abandons her whole life to seek revenge against Abby, who in our eyes is not only reformed, but has also endured quite enough pain and suffering at the hands of the Rattlers, it's not only something that I don't want to take part in as a player, but it's also nonsensical and utterly infuriating. It's nonsensical because, first of all, in order for it to happen, it needs to have characters act completely beyond themselves to set it up. Second, the story has already told both the player and Ellie that Ellie will gain absolutely nothing from this, so it comes off as thematically redundant. Sure, Ellie's tormented by Joel's death, but we already know going after Abby again isn't going to help because it already didn't help Abby when she got her revenge on Joel. That's what her story was about. What's more, Ellie already tried getting her revenge and it ended terribly for her. And this time nobody's gonna have her back because either they got hurt too or they wisened the hell up. And it's infuriating because we the players know that based on previous experience playing as Ellie, that this will only make her look like an even bigger, even more psychopathic piece of shit. Which it does.
I'm not gonna fight you. Yes, you will.
What makes it worse is that she doesn't even follow through with killing Abby, and yet she still loses everything. It's like at this point you can't make it any clearer that this is futile, so what was the point of that? She conveniently remembers at the last second a conversation she had with Joel before he died, where she said she wanted to forgive him for what he did, and so somehow this is the moment where she magically becomes mature enough to forgive Abby, and just lets her go. So yeah, I guess she did learn a lot from this. It only cost her absolutely everything. And if for some reason she forgot about this conversation until now, I can't help but notice the amazing timing when it finally comes back. She could have remembered this conversation at any point during or after Seattle when it would have actually made a difference. Jessie might still be alive if she had remembered this during those first 3 days when everyone was telling her to quit it. But this late in the story, you literally have nothing else to lose, so why remember it at all?
Scott! Okay, fine, I'm cool, I'm fine.
So yeah, The Last of Us Part 2 is not the game for me. There are parts that I liked, there are parts that I disliked, there are parts that I loved, and there are parts that I absolutely despised. I'd be lying if I said I didn't enjoy some of it, but I would also be lying if I said I wasn't still disappointed. And to be completely fair, the first game would have been hard to live up to, and I can certainly appreciate Neil Druckmann at least giving us something new and different and unexpected in a sequel, but it doesn't change how I felt about what we got. Now maybe when they incorporate Part 2 into the show, things will be different. They're already changing the way the story's going to be told, so maybe seeing it as a TV show will be better. I certainly hope so. At least for right now, I'm enjoying the HBO show, and I still have the first game to look back on, so it's not a total loss. So what are you guys' thoughts on The Last of Us Part 2? Do you enjoy it? Are you excited to see it translated to TV? And what are some of your favorite moments from the game? Let me know in the comments. As always, be sure to like this video and subscribe, follow us on all our social medias, and please support our Patreon so you can get the chance to request a movie or show you'd like to see us talk about next. Thank you guys so much for watching. This is Diego for Cinemageddon Reviews, and I'll see you on the Wasteland.